There are some stories you don't realize are unfinished until it's too late to ask how they end. My grandfather used to tell this story every summer. Same porch, same wooden chair that creaked when he leaned back, same glass of sweet tea sweating in his hand like it was nervous. And every single time, he stopped at the exact same place, right when it got uncomfortable. Now, when you're young, you don't notice patterns like that. You just think that's how old folks are, rambling, forgetful, losing their place. But as I got older, I realized something. My grandfather wasn't forgetting the rest of the story. He was choosing not to tell it. And the reason why? I didn't learn until the day he died. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. Something tighter. Controlled. They were close, or at least that's what we were told. Worked together, shared money, shared plans, shared trust. And every time my grandfather reached that part of the story, he'd pause, take a sip of tea, look off toward the road like he was watching something approach that never came. Then he'd say, "That's when I learned something about people." And just like that, the story stopped. Every time. Someone would ask, "Learned what?" And he'd smile, that slow, knowing smile. "Some lessons ain't for telling," he'd say. "They're for surviving." And then he'd stand up, stretch his back, and say something like, "Y'all hungry?" Pattern interrupt. Story over. Now here's where it gets strange. As the years passed, my grandfather didn't forget anything else. He remembered names, dates, faces from 50 years ago. But that story? Still unfinished. Still frozen in time, right at the moment where betrayal should have been named. And I want you to think about that for a second. What kind of pain makes a grown man carry silence for decades instead of relief? What kind of truth gets heavier the longer you hold it? The older I got, the more curious I became. I started noticing how people reacted to my grandfather. Some folks were warm, others were polite but stiff, and a few, just a few, avoided him altogether, wouldn't meet his eyes, wouldn't stay long. That didn't match the gentle man I knew. So one day, when I was old enough to think I deserved answers, I asked him directly. I said, "Why don't you ever finish that story?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked me a question. "You ever notice how quiet water runs deep?" I said, "Yeah," trying to sound smart. He nodded. "That story's deep," he said, "and not everybody can swim." Then he laughed. Just a little. Humor. Deflection. But his eyes didn't laugh. And right there, something shifted in me. Because for the first time, I realized that story wasn't about the past. It was about power. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that my grandfather wasn't hiding the ending because he was ashamed. He was hiding it because the truth would have changed how we saw him and how others feared him. But the truth has a way of surfacing when time runs out, and time was running out. The night before he died, he called me into his room. That alone told me something was different. He looked smaller in the bed, weaker, but his eyes sharp as ever. He motioned for me to sit, and the first thing he said was, "You remember that story I never finished?" My heart dropped, because when a man like that brings something back up, it's never casual. And what he told me next was nothing like I expected. Because the betrayal wasn't what shocked me, It was what he did after it happened. My grandfather took a long breath before he spoke again. Not the kind you take because you're tired, the kind you take because you're about to open a door you've kept locked for a lifetime. "I never told that story," he said, "because people don't always understand restraint." Then he looked at me and asked something unexpected. "You believe a man can be dangerous without ever raising his hand?" I didn't answer right away. He smiled faintly. "Good," he said, "means you're listening." And then, for the first time in my life, he finished the story. Back then, he and his brother had gone into business together. Nothing fancy, just land, hard work, and trust. My grandfather was the planner, the saver, the one who read the fine print. His brother? The talker, the charmer, the one everybody liked. That mattered more than people realize, because when things go wrong, folks don't always side with who's right. They side with who feels familiar. One day, my grandfather came home early, earlier than usual. No warning. And sometimes life hands you truth like that, unannounced. He found papers on the table, bank documents, signatures, his name signed. Only problem was, he hadn't signed them. Someone else had. And he knew exactly who. Now, let me pause right here, because most people, when they hear this part, expect yelling, confrontation, chaos. But that's not who my grandfather was. He sat down, read everything twice, and then he did something that confused even me when I heard it years later. He folded the papers neatly, put them back exactly where he found them, and went to work the next morning like nothing was wrong. No explosion, no accusations, just patience. That kind of patience that makes impulsive people nervous. For months, he watched, listened, noticed things he'd ignored before. Who stopped calling him? Who suddenly had excuses? Who avoided eye contact? And the deeper he looked, the clearer it became. His brother hadn't just betrayed him, he'd turned people against him. Quietly, carefully, made it look like my grandfather was the problem. And here's the part that usually gets folks shaking their heads. My grandfather let it happen. Not because he was weak, because he was learning. One night, after dinner, his brother finally said it, sat across from him and spoke like it was business. "I think it's best if you step away," his brother said. "People trust me more." Can you imagine hearing that from your own blood? My grandfather said the room felt quiet enough to hear his own heartbeat, but his face? Calm. "If that's what you think," he replied. And that was it. No argument, no defense. He walked away from the business, from the land, from years of work, and people thought he lost. Oh, they talked. Said he got outsmarted, said he was too soft, said he didn't have the stomach for the game. My grandfather heard all of it and said nothing. Here's a question for you listening right now. Have you ever been wronged so deeply that explaining it felt pointless? Like the truth wouldn't land anyway? That's where he was. So instead of fighting for his reputation, he focused on something else. Time. Years passed. The business grew, on paper at least. My grandfather worked quietly. Different jobs, different connections, always polite, always observant. People underestimated him constantly, and he let them. Because when someone underestimates you, they show you everything. Their habits, their weaknesses, their blind spots, and my grandfather was watching all of it. Then one day, out of nowhere, his brother showed up at his door, unannounced. Older now, more tired, that confidence? Cracked. He needed help, money problems, legal trouble. Turns out the same charm that built his success had finally caught up with him. He asked my grandfather for a loan. Just temporary, just family. My grandfather listened, didn't interrupt, didn't react. Then he stood up, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out a folder. Old, yellowed, carefully kept. Inside were copies of those same documents from years ago, the forged signatures, the quiet betrayal. Proof. He placed the folder on the table and slid it toward his brother. And then he said something I will never forget. "I told you once," he said calmly, "quiet water runs deep." His brother went pale. And right there, that was the moment the power shifted. But my grandfather's still wasn't finished, because what he did next wasn't revenge. It was something far more unsettling. Because instead of using the evidence to destroy him, my grandfather made a different choice, one that nobody saw coming. My grandfather didn't raise his voice, didn't lean forward, didn't threaten. He just sat there, hands folded, looking at his brother the way a man looks at someone who already knows they've lost. Silence filled the room. Not awkward silence, heavy silence, the kind that makes grown men uncomfortable. His brother finally spoke. "What do you want?" he asked. That question right there told my grandfather everything. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "I was wrong," just, "What do you want?" My grandfather closed the folder. Slowly. "Nothing," he said. That shook his brother more than any threat could have. "Nothing?" his brother repeated. "Then why keep this?" My grandfather stood up and poured them both some water. A simple act, almost polite. Pattern interrupt. Then he said, "Because one day you were going to forget what you did, and I wasn't." Let me tell you something most people don't understand. When someone wrongs you and you explode, they get relief. They release the guilt. They tell themselves you were the problem. But when you stay calm, when you don't chase justice loudly, they have to sit with it every day. And my grandfather made his brother sit with it for decades. He handed the folder back. "I won't use this," he said, "but you'll know I could." That was the deal. No courts, no public shame, just quiet accountability. His brother nodded, left without another word, and my grandfather never mentioned it again. Not to him, not to anyone, except now to me. I asked him something that had been sitting in my chest. Why didn't you take everything back? Why not expose him? He looked at me like I'd asked a child's question. "Because power isn't about winning loudly," he said. "It's about choosing when not to destroy." That sentence stayed with me, especially in a world that rewards spectacle. Here's the part that stunned me. Years later, when my grandfather was stable, comfortable, respected in quiet ways, he helped his brother anyway. Not directly, no handouts, but connections, recommendations, just enough. Not out of love, out of principle. "If I let bitterness run my life," he said, "then he'd still be in control." That's when I understood. The story wasn't about betrayal, it was about mastery. Now, let me zoom out for a second, because if you're listening and thinking, "I could never do that," you're not alone. Most people can't. Patience feels like weakness when you're hurting. Silence feels like surrender. But my grandfather knew something most people learn too late. Time amplifies character, good or bad, and he was willing to wait. I asked him if he ever regretted it. Not telling the story, not warning people, not defending his name. He smiled. Regret comes from needing applause, he said. I was never performing. Then he laughed softly. Besides, he added, everybody who needed to know eventually did. That night, as he lay back against the pillows, he looked tired, but lighter, like setting that truth down had freed him from carrying it anymore. I asked him why he finally told me. Why now? He said, because stories don't belong to us forever. They're borrowed, and someone has to carry them forward. Then he squeezed my hand. Now you know, he said, so you won't rush to speak when patience would serve you better. He passed the next morning, quietly. No drama, no unfinished business, just peace. But that story, it didn't end with him. It changed how I see betrayal, how I see power, how I see silence. So if you're listening right now and you've been wronged, if someone took from you and walked away smiling, let me ask you something my grandfather taught me without ever saying it outright. Are you trying to be heard, or are you trying to be effective? Because sometimes the strongest move you can make is waiting. And that was the story my grandfather never finished until the day he died. After my grandfather passed, the house felt different. Not louder, not emptier, just still. You ever notice how some people leave noise behind and others leave quiet? His quiet stayed. In the weeks after the funeral, folks stopped by. Old friends, distant relatives, people I'd never seen before. And something strange started happening. They'd sit for a while, talk about weather or work, then lower their voices, lean in, and say things like, "Your grandfather helped me once. He didn't say much, but he changed my life." No details, no stories with flashy endings, just quiet gratitude. That's when it hit me. The power he carried wasn't hidden because it was small. It was hidden because it was controlled. One man, older than my grandfather, stayed behind after everyone else left. He looked at me long and hard, then said, "Your grandfather understood something most men don't." I asked him what. He smiled. That when people betray you, he said, they expect a reaction. What they don't expect is discipline. That word landed heavy. Discipline. Not denial, not suppression, choice. I started replaying moments from my childhood, times I thought my grandfather was passive, when he was actually observing. Times I thought he let things slide, when he was deciding what mattered. Times I thought silence meant defeat, when it was strategy. And suddenly, that unfinished story made sense. He wasn't protecting himself, he was protecting us. Because some truths, if told too early, teach the wrong lesson. Let me ask you something, honestly. How many times have you wanted to clear your name, not because it would change the outcome, but because it would soothe your ego? My grandfather knew that feeling. He just didn't let it drive. Years ago, I once asked him why he never talked bad about people who wronged him. He said, "If I need to explain myself to everyone, I'll never have time to live." That sounded simple back then. Now I know it was survival wisdom. Here's the part most folks don't want to hear. Sometimes justice doesn't look like exposure. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like letting time reveal what words never could, because life has a way of removing masks without your help. I think that's why he waited until the end. Not because he was afraid, but because he was finished carrying it. He didn't need validation, didn't need sympathy. He just needed one person to understand so the lesson wouldn't disappear with him. And now, it's yours too. After my grandfather finished telling me the story, I thought that was it. I thought the lesson was simply about patience, about restraint, about quiet strength. But life has a way of testing lessons right after you learn them, because once people found out my grandfather had passed, things started coming out. Things nobody had ever said out loud. It started small. A cousin mentioned something at the repast. "You know," he said casually, "folks used to be scared to cross your grandfather." That didn't sit right with me. Scared? This was the same man who waved at everyone, who spoke gently, who never rushed a conversation. I asked what he meant. My cousin shrugged. "He never threatened anybody," he said. "That's what made it worse." That sentence stuck with me. More stories followed. A man from church said my grandfather once refused to vouch for someone. Didn't insult him, didn't expose him, just said, "I don't know him well enough to recommend him." That man never recovered professionally, not because my grandfather spoke against him, but because people trusted my grandfather's judgment more than gossip. That's when I realized something unsettling. Silence doesn't mean absence of influence. Sometimes silence is authority. I started to understand the cost of the path my grandfather chose, because patience isn't free. You pay for it with misunderstanding, with people assuming you're weak, with folks rewriting the story while you stand there saying nothing. And my grandfather paid that price for years. Here's something nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't just hurt once, it echoes. Every holiday, every family gathering, every time you see the person who did you wrong acting like nothing happened. And my grandfather carried that weight quietly, never poisoned us with it, never turned us bitter. He let us grow up without inheriting his anger. That was intentional. I asked myself a hard question after he died. Could I have done that? Honestly, I don't know, because there's a difference between knowing restraint and living it for decades. One evening, weeks later, I went back to that porch. Same chair, same view of the road. I sat where he used to sit, and for the first time, I noticed something I'd missed my whole life. From that porch, you could see everything: who came, who went, who slowed down, who sped past. He didn't sit there to be seen. He sat there to observe. And suddenly, the unfinished story made even more sense. He stopped telling it at the point of betrayal, because the real story wasn't what they did to him. The real story was what he chose to become afterward. Let me pause and ask you something. Have you ever outgrown the version of yourself that was hurt, but still carry the scar? That's where my grandfather lived. He healed, but he never forgot. Not out of resentment, out of wisdom. As I sat there, I realized something else. The reason the story hit so hard when he finally told it was because he never used it to control us. He didn't say, "Don't trust people." He didn't say, "Family will betray you." He let us come to those conclusions ourselves. That's a different kind of teaching. That night, I finally understood why he waited until the end. Because if he'd told that story too early, we would have focused on the betrayal instead of the discipline, instead of the patience, instead of the power. And then it hit me. The story still wasn't over, because now I was being tested. I didn't expect the test to come so soon. Life usually gives you some time to sit with a lesson, admire it, Maybe even quote it to somebody else like you've mastered it. Not this time. 3 months after my grandfather passed, I found myself staring at a familiar feeling, that tightness in the chest, that quiet disbelief, that moment where you realize someone you trusted wasn't who you thought they were. I was working with someone close to me. Not family by blood, but close enough to feel like it counted. We had plans, shared responsibilities, mutual understanding, or so I thought. Then one afternoon, a phone call came in. Short, awkward, a little too careful with words. That's usually how it starts. I was told decisions had been made, without me. Money involved, credit shifted, my name mentioned in rooms I wasn't invited into. Nothing illegal, just familiar. And all of a sudden, I was standing in my grandfather's shoes. Same crossroads, different generation. My first instinct? React. Call everybody. Clear my name. Explain my side. You know that urge, the one that feels righteous but leaves you exhausted. I even picked up the phone, thumb hovering over the screen, and then I heard my grandfather's voice in my head. Are you trying to be heard, or are you trying to be effective? I set the phone down. That decision cost me. Let me be honest about that, because patience doesn't come with instant rewards. People started acting funny, some avoided me, some assumed things, some stopped calling altogether. And I won't lie, there were nights I replayed conversations, wishing I'd said more. Silence can feel lonely when you're misunderstood, but it also gives you something priceless: clarity. Instead of talking, I watched. Instead of defending, I documented. Instead of reacting, I waited. And the longer I waited, the more patterns showed themselves. Who benefited? Who repeated half-truths? Who stayed neutral? And who quietly checked in without asking questions? Those are the people you remember. Here's something nobody prepares you for. When you don't fight back right away, people assume you can't. They get careless. They say things they shouldn't. They contradict themselves. They forget you're paying attention. And just like my grandfather, I learned more by staying quiet than I ever would have by arguing. One evening, someone involved reached out, wanted to talk things through. That phrase usually means they're uncomfortable, not apologetic. I agreed to meet, sat across from them, listened. No accusations, no emotion, just calm. They talked themselves into a corner, filled the silence with explanations I never asked for, and suddenly, the power dynamic shifted, not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't need to. I walked away from that situation without confrontation, without exposure, without revenge. And people thought I lost. Again. I heard the whispers. He let that slide. Couldn't handle it. Too nice for his own good. Sound familiar? It did to me. And for a moment, I wondered if patience was just another word for avoidance. Then, time did what time always does. The truth surfaced. Not because I forced it, but because lies need maintenance, and maintenance gets exhausting. Stories changed, excuses didn't line up, trust eroded. Meanwhile, I kept showing up the same, consistent, grounded, unbothered. That unsettled people more than anger ever could. Months later, I got a call, an apology. Quiet, incomplete, but real enough. And in that moment, I finally understood my grandfather completely. Patience isn't passive. It's active restraint. It's choosing not to spend your energy proving what time will reveal anyway. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you've lived long enough, you've faced this test too. Maybe at work, maybe in family, maybe in a friendship that didn't survive success. The question isn't whether betrayal comes. The question is, who do you become afterward? I realized something else that night. My grandfather didn't just leave me a story, he left me a standard. And living up to it, that's the hardest part. I looked at that porch again in my mind, the quiet chair, the slow evenings, and I finally understood why he seemed so at peace. He wasn't free from betrayal. He was free from letting it define him. There's something about silence that makes certain people uncomfortable. Not peaceful silence, not reflective silence. I'm talking about the kind of silence that comes from someone who knows exactly who they are. That kind of quiet scares loud people. I started noticing it after everything settled. The people who had once been confident now spoke carefully around me. The ones who used to dominate conversations suddenly filled the space with nervous jokes. And the ones who expected confrontation, they never got it. That confused them because manipulators depend on reaction. They need you emotional, defensive, explaining yourself. Silence starves them. My grandfather understood this long before psychology books put names to it. He once told me, years before he finished the story, if someone needs you loud to feel powerful, your quiet becomes a threat. At the time, I thought it sounded poetic. Now I know it was tactical. Here's what happens when you don't rush to respond. People start projecting. They assume you're planning something. They wonder what you know. They worry about what you might say, even if you never do. And in that worry, they reveal themselves. That's what happened with my grandfather's brother. And it's what happened with me. Let me give you a small example. At a gathering months later, someone tried to joke about the situation. Lighthearted, dismissive. I smiled, said nothing. The room shifted, because when you don't defend yourself, others start defending you. Not because you asked, but because consistency builds credibility. That's something time teaches you. Reputation isn't what you say. It's what people experience repeatedly. My grandfather never corrected rumors. He outlived them. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Silence only works when it's backed by integrity. If you're quiet and inconsistent, people don't respect you. They overlook you. But when you're quiet and solid, predictable in your values, that combination is rare. And rare things make people uneasy. I saw this play out again and again. The people who stayed close didn't need explanations. The ones who needed drama drifted away. And honestly, that was a relief, because silence also filters your circle. I thought about my grandfather's brother, how he built success loudly, charisma, talk, visibility. But when the foundation cracked, there was nothing underneath. No patience, no discipline, just noise. And noise doesn't hold up under pressure. Here's a question I want you to sit with. When things go wrong in your life, do you reach for volume or do you reach for stability? Because one feels powerful in the moment, the other actually is. I used to think my grandfather was calm because life had been kind to him. I was wrong. He was calm because life had tested him, and he passed the test without needing applause. There's a reason older folks often say, just watch. It's not indifference, it's wisdom. It's knowing that people reveal more when they think you're not reacting. I wish I could tell you silence always leads to satisfaction. It doesn't. Sometimes it leaves you misunderstood. Sometimes it leaves you lonely. But it also leaves you intact. And at this stage of life, that matters more than being right. The final thing my grandfather taught me about quiet power was this: you don't use it to dominate, you use it to protect your peace. And once I understood that, everything else fell into place. Here's the part nobody talks about. Silence isn't free. It may protect your dignity, but it still costs you something. My grandfather never complained, but that doesn't mean he wasn't tired. And after everything I went through, I finally understood the weight he carried. When you know the truth and choose not to speak it, you give up certain comforts. You give up being immediately understood. You give up sympathy. You give up the relief of being believed on the spot. And for someone who values honesty, that's a heavy trade. There were nights after my situation when I wanted to break. Not dramatically, just quietly explain, lay it all out, say, here's what really happened. Because silence can feel like you're agreeing with the lie. That's the hardest part. I remembered something my grandfather once said when he thought I wasn't listening. Truth don't need company, he muttered. It can sit by itself. At the time, I laughed. Now, I felt it. Carrying truth alone makes you selective about where you go, who you talk to, what conversations you enter. You stop wasting breath on people who already decided their version of you. That kind of discipline can feel isolating, but it also sharpens you. I started noticing how much energy people spent defending themselves, how exhausted they looked, always explaining, always reacting, always correcting. And I realized something uncomfortable. I had more peace, even while misunderstood, than they had with all their explanations. Still, I won't pretend it was easy. There was a moment, just one, where I almost spoke up. A mutual acquaintance said something publicly that wasn't true. Not cruel, just wrong. Everyone looked at me, waiting. That pause stretched, and in that second, I felt every ounce of my grandfather's restraint press down on me. I smiled, changed the subject, went home with my jaw tight. That night, I asked myself, was this strength or avoidance? That's a fair question, especially for anyone listening who's held their tongue longer than they should have, because silence becomes dangerous when it's used to avoid truth. My grandfather knew the difference. He didn't stay quiet because he was afraid. He stayed quiet because speaking wouldn't serve the outcome. Here's the line most people miss. Silence is not permanent. It's timed. My grandfather didn't take his story to the grave. He passed it on when it mattered, when it could teach instead of inflame. That's wisdom. The cost of carrying truth alone is paid up front. The reward? It comes later, in clarity, in peace, in watching the truth surface without your fingerprints on it. I began to see the pattern clearly. Those who lied grew louder. Those who manipulated grew defensive. Those who told half-truths kept adjusting their stories. And I stayed the same. That consistency became my voice. That's when it hit me. Silence isn't the absence of communication. It's a different language, one most people don't understand until it's too late. The truth has a strange rhythm. It doesn't rush, it doesn't announce itself, and it almost never arrives when you're begging for it. It shows up when people are tired of pretending. About a year after everything happened, I got a call I wasn't expecting. No apology, no explanation, just a simple sentence. I owe you an honest conversation. I didn't feel excited. I felt calm. That's how I knew time had done its work. We met. Same table, different energy. The confidence that once filled the room, gone. Not replaced by humility, but by weariness. They talked. I listened. Again. And here's the part that surprised me. They told the truth without me asking a single question. Every missing detail, every quiet decision, every moment they thought silence meant permission. They confessed because they needed relief, not because I demanded it. That's when I understood something my grandfather never said outright. Truth doesn't always come to clear your name. Sometimes it comes to free the liar, and when it does, you get to choose whether to receive it. I didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't say, I knew it, because when someone finally tells the truth after living with it, they already know what it cost them. That's punishment enough. Afterward, something shifted publicly. Not dramatically, just subtly. Invitations changed, tones softened. People started saying things like, I always wondered. Something never sat right with me. That's how truth works in real life. Not with fireworks, but with quiet recognition. I thought about my grandfather constantly during that time, about how he must have watched similar moments unfold, how he stayed steady while others scrambled, how he didn't need to say, I told you so, because time said it for him. One evening, I went back to that porch again, sat in the same chair, watched the same road, and for the first time, I noticed something else. From that porch, you could also see who came back, who slowed down, who stopped, who turned around. My grandfather didn't just observe betrayal, he observed return. That's when it finally clicked. The story he never finished wasn't unfinished. It was still unfolding through me, through others, through every moment where patience outlasted deception. I realized something else, too. If my grandfather had told that story earlier, I would have admired it, but I wouldn't have understood it. Now, I lived it, and understanding changes how you move through the world. The truth eventually spoke, not loudly, not publicly, but clearly enough for those who mattered. And the rest? They didn't need convincing, they just needed time. That night, I whispered something into the quiet air. Not a prayer, not a promise, just gratitude. For a lesson taught slowly, for strength that didn't need an audience, for a story that waited until I was ready. As I've gotten older, I've realized something about lessons. The ones that change you don't arrive loudly. They arrive slowly, then stay with you. That was my grandfather's way. He never finished that story when I was young because I didn't need information. I needed formation. I needed years. I needed perspective. I needed my own scars. Only then could the lesson land. The story wasn't about betrayal. It was about what betrayal tries to steal from you. Your peace, your dignity, your sense of self. And my grandfather refused to hand those things over. He showed me that you don't have to expose every wrong to be right. You don't have to correct every lie to live truthfully. You don't have to respond to every insult to keep your power. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is remain unchanged. I look at the world differently now. I don't rush conversations. I don't chase explanations. I don't panic when misunderstood because I've seen what time does to the truth. It doesn't bury it, it reveals it. If you're listening and you've been carrying something quietly, if you've been misunderstood longer than feels fair, if you've been tempted to explain yourself one more time, let me tell you what my grandfather taught me without ever saying it directly. Your life is speaking, even when you aren't. People are watching patterns, not speeches. They're noticing who stays steady, who shows up the same, who doesn't need drama to feel important. And over time, those patterns tell the story better than words ever could. My grandfather never finished that story out loud, but he lived the ending every day. Calm, patient, unshaken. And when the time came, he passed the lesson on, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with clarity. So here's the question I'll leave you with, and I hope you sit with it, not answer it quickly. What kind of story is your life telling even when you say nothing? Thank you for listening. And if the story reminded you of someone who taught you quietly, or a moment where patience protected you, then maybe the lesson found the right ears.